So I'll start with something that you're probably all quite familiar with, but I think is really important to touch on actually, is why is regulatory affairs important? When I started in my career, I certainly wasn't overly familiar with regulatory affairs. It was a department that I'd heard of, but I didn't really understand the value of them. So I always like to say when I'm speaking with people who are perhaps quite junior or just new in the industry that regulatory affairs takes complex information and makes it simple. There's lots of words on this slide that basically say that, but our job as regulatory professionals is really to be taking lots of complex scientific data and put it into a package that can be assessed for one, but also to be able to have discussions around those data. It's also part of our job is really trying to drive innovation and look at the currently accepted standards and push them. Can we improve things? So our job is really pivotal in a lot of different phases in the life cycle of a product. So this slide here, I know it's quite small as well, and I believe that you will be provided with all of the slides, but this is really a great demonstration of where regulatory affairs is involved and at different phases as well. So you'll see that there are some of those pink boxes are the entire life cycle. So right from CMC, GMP quality discussions all the way through to post-approval once a product is actually on the market. And what I would say is when you're starting in your career, think about what area of regulatory affairs appeals to you. When I was junior, I'd been in the industry now for 20 years, and I always had a real strong interest in clinical development. I started off in the lab and then really moved into clinical trials. So that kind of fourth column along there, the clinical phase 2, 3, or even the early phase and early development services. I always had a real interest in that part of the process. Whereas some people are much more interested in actually physically doing that marketing dossier to get the product on the market. But you'll see there's a variety of different aspects along the course of the development. So things like scientific advice, going to an agency meeting, looking at the strategy from the beginning, from that early development for the chemistry manufacturing controls, all the way through looking at the product strategy. And along the way, we're gathering intelligence, we're assessing data, and really looking to our peers and providing input to our colleagues and to regulatory agencies. So it's worthwhile really thinking about where does your passion lie, because that will help at the next stage when you think about where you want your career to go. So that said, I would definitely advise people to strategically plan your career as much as you can. If I think back to all of those years ago, I'm not sure that I really strategically planned my career. Some things, opportunities arise that you will take or not. But when you're early on, do think about geographically, where do you want to be working? Are you thinking about a certain country like the UK or Ireland, or are you thinking more globally? There are opportunities both in country and thinking on a more global scale. Also think about education. So education is very important and there are lots of opportunities. There's lots of training courses, there's lots of postgraduate courses, with TOPRA, with other organizations. You've got MBAs, there's an RAC certificate, which is advantageous to those working in the US, but also it's not advantageous for those working outside of the US. But really consider what's important. Higher degrees are important, but I would say I interview multiple people, and experience is very important, and not necessarily having a higher degree. So someone with a PhD is not automatically chosen over someone without a PhD, for example. And I think that that last bullet point there is really important, that you do need to think about the balance between pushing yourself to have many qualifications and things and getting out of your depth. So you want to balance by gaining knowledge, but regulatory is certainly a discipline, in my experience, that you very much learn by doing. Things change very quickly. Um, Guidance and regulations are constantly changing. There's constantly discussion about multiple guidelines across the globe. So what might be relevant one day, in 6 months' time, it could have slightly shifted. So there is a very fine balance between, gaining lots of different qualifications and actually gaining experience. So the next step really is research. We all do research. We will all have done research throughout our careers, even early on. And first and foremost, LinkedIn is an excellent platform to use, and I'm sure it's been mentioned before today as well. But top tips is make sure that your LinkedIn profile matches your CV. It's very easy to forget that you update your CV with some relevant information and you don't update your profile. And there's ways to search within LinkedIn. So make sure that you're looking at company pages that you're interested in, follow them. Then you'll make sure that you see updates and perhaps adverts on when they are recruiting. And also for your own profile, make it really clear that that's your desire, that you are looking for a role within regulatory affairs. If you've decided on an area that you have a particular interest, I would put that in too. There's also other ways that you can kind of getting out there. So networking events, obviously that's quite difficult at the moment because it's mostly online and with the restrictions in place because of COVID. But there will be opportunities there for you to network and to introduce yourself, to gain information. There's obviously recruitment consultants, online searching for job sites, but also really do look at specific company websites that you perhaps have an interest in. There's pharmaceutical companies, there's contract research organisations such as PRA, and our competitors, and also consultancy firms as well. So make sure that you are really covering the broad range of availability out there. And one thing to never ignore is when intern positions are coming up. Certainly at PRA, we have had intern positions in the past, and it's an excellent way to start off in your career. So making contact. This can sometimes be a little bit onerous. You might be a bit nervous about making contact, but what I would say is don't be nervous. But what's really important is that you remember that every interaction you have with a potential employer is important, whether that's by phone, whether it's an email. So try and remember to always be professional, polite, and clear. I have to say, if I was to receive an email or an application for a position within my organization, that there was a cover letter that was 5 pages long describing a whole a vast explanation of your experience and why you should be employed, that for me would not demonstrate a great regulatory attribute, which is taking complex information and making it succinct and understandable to a layperson. So think about when you're communicating and how you're communicating. Submit your CV, and I think it's important to know that speculative applications do work. We've received CVs and certainly have taken those candidates forward, even if we haven't had a specific role open at that time. Also, make sure that you are tailoring your CV. It will be quite general perhaps early on, but there are always ways to tailor your CV. Look at your transferable skills. And that, I have to say, is something that I always look at. You know, there's not a one route into regulatory affairs. There's all of my colleagues and peers, we all have very different paths to where we are now. Some have started in QA, some have started in a lab, some have been CRAs, some have been in quality. You know, there's huge, huge differences across our organisation. So look at those transferable skills. What did you learn in a previous position, whether that was in the industry or not? Communication is key. So demonstrating your communication skills is really going to make you noticeable. Also make notes of the timeline. So when you do submit your CV for a position, typically you should hear within 2 weeks, maybe sooner than that. Depends on the process internally. But remember, there is always an internal process. You would be going to a recruitment consultant perhaps, or an internal recruitment consultant. They will then need to speak with the regulatory department. There will perhaps need to be approvals in place. So don't be disheartened if you don't hear immediately once you've submitted your CV for review. And be positive. I think that's the thing. If you're confident that you've tailored your CV appropriately, that you've come across as being passionate and professional with those transferable skills being noticeable, then be prepared, be positive. So interviews now, interviews are quite a personal thing. And some organizations will have a very set and standard way of interviewing, others may not. My experience throughout my career is that most interviews are not, I don't want to say informal, but less structured. You know, there's not like a test. You know, you hear of some interviews that there's like an aptitude test. That's not been my experience. That's not to say that it wouldn't happen. But make sure that you do understand what the process will be. And that's when your point of contact as a recruitment person, whether it be an internal person or a recruitment consultant, should be able to guide you. So ask those questions. You know, what are the expectations of this process? What do I need to be prepared for? It's a two-way process as well. So as I say, I've done many interviews, and um, it's not just about a company or interviewing a person. It's almost you need to interview them too. You know, do you like the culture of the organization? Do you get a good feeling um, from the person who's interviewing you? First impressions are very important, and I would say that on both sides. Everybody has things that they don't like at an interview. Um, One of mine is that I really don't like when someone doesn't ask me a question, because for me that demonstrates that you've not really prepared for the interview. Um, so again, it goes back to being polite and professional. I would never expect somebody to know everything about a position that they've applied for. So make sure that you do your research and ask questions. And those questions might not necessarily be a technical small part of the role. It could be about the organization. It could be about, you know, how many people do you have in your organization, in your department? What are the expectations of the role that I'm applying for? And things like that. And be honest and open. Um, you'll find if you try to embellish or if you try to make something sound grander than it is, then that comes across. It comes across when people then start being a little flustered because they've perhaps said something that was over exaggerated. And yeah, as I say, always have at least one question, if not more, to ask at an interview, because it does show your level of interest and engagement, that you have that desire, that you would like this job, that you're interested in the position that you've applied for. If at first you don't succeed, please do keep trying. There are many, many different routes to regulatory affairs. As I said, most of my colleagues, peers, and people that I've worked with over the years, no two people have had exactly the same route to regulatory affairs. So if you're not succeeding perhaps in a regulatory affairs position, think a little bit outside of that. If you're interested in clinical trials, for example, clinical trial assistants or associates is a great, an absolutely fantastic grounding on understanding the bigger picture of a clinical trial process. I've listed some others there. That list is not exhaustive, but basically, having experience within the industry is highly valuable. Again, I go back to those transferable skills on communication, on being able to manage a meeting, being able to manage deadlines, to work on multiple tasks. All of those things are very important, and will really set you in good stead to perhaps then look into transitioning towards a regulatory role if that's something that you are really interested in. So thinking about PRA, PRA have many opportunities, and actually some very active opportunities currently, and it is across the life cycle of product development. So going back to that pink slide earlier where regulatory affairs are involved, and we do cover the life cycle of a product in different groups. So my group is the Global Regulatory Clinical Services Group, and we are responsible for all clinical trial applications. Now, that involves the strategy, so a submission strategy, looking at, which countries are we going to submit this in, which one should we target first. And there's lots of aspects that come into making those decisions and giving that advice to a client. We also manage the informed consent forms, and this may seem a little unusual to some people. But an informed consent form, because it's a patient-facing document, um, traditionally years ago was always covered by clinical operations within a clinical trial. But actually, when you think about it and you go back to that very first slide that we were talking there, regulatory affairs is taking complex information and making it understandable for a layperson. And that's exactly what an informed consent form is. A patient needs to understand in very simple language what they're signing up for. We've all seen informed consent forms, whether it be for a clinical trial or for something that you're, having done at a hospital. There's always consent that's required now. And we also cover investigational product labeling and the authoring of the investigational medicinal product dossier. So again, that's taking lots of data and putting it into a format that is a summary. Essentially, an IMPD is a summary. We also have a huge importance on regulatory and country intelligence. So as I've said, regulations, well, particularly in Europe, we obviously have a huge change in a regulation coming in next year. But at a country level, the intelligence that is gathered is phenomenal. Things do change. 2020 was obviously a challenge in many aspects of all of our lives, but from a regulatory perspective, it was a real challenge to ensure compliance, but still make sure that patients who were on clinical trials could still continue. So gathering regulatory and country intelligence is a real key and a cornerstone of what we do. Some of the other groups at PRA, so there is a regulatory strategy group, which is more focused on a product. So my group's very focused on the clinical trial piece, but obviously products are developed. So there is consultation around that product development, and thinking about maybe the agency meetings that are product specific, not necessarily clinical trial specific, because we obviously can meet about a specific clinical trial as well. There are also some other groups that you can be aware of. So there's the CMC group. So as the name indicates, very much focused on the chemistry, manufacturing and controls, primarily around those marketing authorizations, so the modules 2 and 3, and really gathering all of that information and getting it into the correct format. There's regulatory operations, which you may not have heard of. If you want to think about regulatory operations, they're very much like the project manager for a marketing authorization. So making sure that if you've got a target date for your submission of that MA or NDA, that everything comes into place at the right time, and is published accordingly. And then you've obviously got labeling as well. So to make sure everyone understands, there's what my group is involved in is investigational product labeling, and labeling in the wider term is product labeling. So like the summary of product characteristics or the patient information leaflets. And all of these, obviously, that's covering the life cycle of a product that went back to that pink slide there. So the next slide is really just to say thank you. My email address is there if anyone should want to contact for more information. I hope that was useful to you. Certainly, I have a lot of experience with interviews and recruitment, so if anyone does have questions, then I'm more than happy to answer those.
Thank you very much. That's very, very insightful again. So let's see if there's any questions. What makes applicants stand out in interview is the first question.
There are different things that make people stand out, and it does depend on the role that you're applying for. From my perspective, I would say that someone stands out who comes across as being enthusiastic, who has done a bit of research. For me, because my group is very focused on the clinical trial piece, it's good to hear when people have, at least if you're very new to the industry, you've at least looked at, for example, the MHRA guidance for clinical trials, that you're aware of that you understand or you are aware of ICH GCP, because those are fundamental to what we do. So someone who has done a little research and has shown that interest in that, I'm interested in this position. So therefore, I've taken the time to actually look at what you do. So that is very important to me. Being able to demonstrate as well those transferable skills. So I will always have seen someone's CV before I set up an interview with them. And I will always start an interview by saying that. I don't want someone to reiterate and read their CV back to me. I want to know the bits that are not on your CV. So, you can say about something that you've done, but expand on it a little. Someone who's engaged also, that's definitely something that I look for. If you're distracted or you're late, obviously we're doing everything online at the moment, so it's video interviews. So someone who is not engaged, or you can tell they're distracted, is not a very good impression. So those are probably the main things that I look for. Someone who can communicate with me. Regulatory affairs is about communication, and if you can't communicate effectively, it's not going to put you in a good stead, in my opinion. So communication is very important.
Okay. And what do you find challenging in your role?
In my own role, from an interview perspective?
No, I think just generally day-to-day work-wise.
Day to day, from my perspective, my role is very much a leader within the group. So the challenges that I face are very different to somebody who's operational. So my challenges would usually be around making sure that my team is supported. to make sure that they have everything that they need to be able to do their job. So that might be some advice that could be, IMPD related, or it could be something more general. So I'm very much a line manager more now than I have been in the past. So my team is my number one priority, and my extended team as well. So those are the challenges just now, along with everything else to do with COVID that everybody has.
Sure. So next question, as a contract research organization, would you recruit someone with previous RA experience, but without prior clinical trials experience? How
Absolutely.
can someone like that demonstrate that they are familiar with clinical trials basics?
So absolutely, we would look at regulatory experience from another discipline. What I would say is if you were looking to get into the clinical trial field, then at that interview stage, acknowledge that you haven't worked in clinical trials before, but say, but I have been looking at ICH-GCP. I'm aware of the EU clinical trial regulation. I've been looking into those aspects. And I can relate that to what I have already done. So there's always opportunity there, and any regulatory experience is always valuable, because you have that mindset.
Okay. And another question, will you accept candidates into pharma regulatory roles who have prior experience in biocidal products only? What level of a role would you recommend for these candidates?
So again, I think it's the same thing. So any experience is great, but it's making sure that you then tailor your CV to say how that experience is relevant and what you can bring to the table. So if you're looking to move into a different role, well, how can that relate? Think about your transferable skills, your communication, your ability to, I don't want to say multitask because multitasking doesn't exist, but your ability to manage things and prioritize accordingly. So it's all of those other skills that you don't want to put yourself into a box that this is the only experience I have, so therefore I would have to be an entry level into another discipline, because that doesn't always happen. Actually, very recently, I've just recruited somebody who hasn't ever worked in the clinical trial field, but they have been involved in, for example, writing product information leaflets. So that's a huge transferable skill to be able to write an ICF. If you can write a product information leaflet, the process is the same. So it's trying to find those common grounds that you can say, but yeah, I may not have done this, but I have done this, and I think that it's very similar for this reason. And if you're not sure, ask the question at the interview. As I said, that's a very much a two-way process. That means that you can say, well, I have this experience. What do you think that that's valuable? I think it's valuable because of these reasons. And I, make yourself more attractive in that way, to say, I think that this is very important. I think that this would transfer to this aspect of what you do. But yeah, absolutely, there's all experiences is relevant and valuable.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much. So, unfortunately, that's all we have time for now. But we have made a note of all the questions asked, and those that haven't been answered yet, they will be answered after the event. So, but your contact details are still on screen, so you can also be contacted directly. Is that right, Louise?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my the presentation now.
Thank you for that, Eric. Thank you.
That's absolutely fine, and it was great. And so we'll now move on to our final presentation of the day.